The NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, was home to some of the world's brightest minds. Scientists, engineers, and astrophysicists, all working tirelessly on missions that would define the future of space exploration. But among them, unnoticed and overlooked, was Frank Holloway. A janitor. At 62 years old, Frank had been cleaning the same hallways for nearly 3 decades. He had seen men walk on the moon, watched Mars rovers come to life, and witnessed the launch of telescopes capable of peering into galaxies millions of light years away. Yet despite being surrounded by brilliance, no one ever asked Frank what he thought, because to them he was just the janitor. A problem no one could solve. It was a crisp morning when Frank entered the conference wing. He moved quietly, as he always did, emptying trash cans and wiping down tables while the scientists argued. Their voices were sharp, frustrated. "We're running out of time," one of them said. "If we can't fix this problem, the entire mission is dead." Frank glanced at the whiteboard at the front of the room. It was covered in complex equations, trajectory models, and pressure calculations. Even without fully understanding them, Frank recognized the desperation in their voices. Something was wrong. As he continued cleaning, he overheard something that made him pause. "The heat shield won't hold," another scientist said. "The stress points are too concentrated. If we can't redistribute the force during re-entry, it'll tear apart." Frank's brow furrowed. He didn't know much about spacecraft engineering, but he did know a thing or two about structures, weight distribution, and materials. Because before he was a janitor, he had been a carpenter. The humbling of great minds. As the scientists continued their heated discussion, Frank moved closer, pretending to clean a nearby counter. One of the engineers let out a frustrated sigh. "We've already tried reinforcing the shield, changing the materials, and adjusting the trajectory. Nothing works. The forces during re-entry are just too extreme." Frank hesitated. He had seen this exact problem before. Not in space, not on a billion-dollar spacecraft, but on a simple wooden bridge. Years ago, Frank had worked on a suspension bridge project. The same issue had come up. Too much stress in one area, causing structural weaknesses. And the solution had been so simple, it was almost laughable. Frank opened his mouth, then stopped. Would they even listen to him? Number they were NASA engineers. He was a janitor. But what if he was right? Finally, he took a deep breath. "Excuse me, gentlemen." The room went dead silent. 12 of the most brilliant minds in the country turned to look at him. Frank swallowed hard. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're saying the problem is with the heat shield, right?" One of the scientists, Dr. Logan Mills, a senior aerospace engineer, raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you know about spacecraft heat shields?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. Frank cleared his throat. "Not much, but I do know about stress points." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some of the scientists exchanged glances, half amused, half annoyed. Dr. Mills sighed. "Look, we appreciate the enthusiasm, but this is highly advanced physics. It's not a—" "What if you spread out the stress?" Frank interrupted. Silence. Dr. Mills frowned. "What?" Frank stepped forward, cautiously. "I used to work construction before becoming a janitor. We had a similar problem once. Too much weight on one section of a bridge, causing structural weaknesses." The engineers stared. Frank hesitated, then pointed at the whiteboard. Your issue isn't that the shield is weak. It's that the force isn't being spread out evenly. You're letting it concentrate in one place." One of the younger engineers scoffed. "You think we haven't tried reinforcement?" Frank shook his head. "No, reinforcement isn't the answer. Redirection is." Dr. Mills's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Frank's confidence grew slightly. "In construction, when a bridge can't handle stress, we add flexible plates that absorb and redirect the force along a wider area. It prevents structural failure by distributing the load." He motioned to their designs. "You're treating the heat shield like a solid structure. But what if it wasn't? What if it could bend slightly, absorb the impact, and redirect it across a larger surface area?" A deep silence fell over the room. For the first time, the engineers weren't laughing. The seed of doubt. Dr. Mills turned to one of the junior engineers. "Pull up the current stress analysis model." The young man scrambled to bring up a simulation on the screen. It showed exactly what they had been struggling with: extreme concentrated stress points along the shield during re-entry. Dr. Mills stroked his chin. "If we spread the force, like flexible plating." Frank nodded. "The way steel plates on bridges distribute pressure." Another scientist murmured, "Wait a minute. If we used interlocking heat-resistant plates instead of one rigid shield." A few of them began scribbling calculations. The room's energy had shifted. Frank took a step back. He could feel it. They were actually considering his idea. The moment of rejection. Just then a sharp voice cut through the discussion. "This is ridiculous." All heads turned toward Dr. Alan Kendrick, one of the highest-ranking engineers in the facility. He folded his arms, his gaze cold. "We are NASA. We don't take engineering advice from janitors." The room fell silent. Frank felt a pang of humiliation, but he refused to let it show. Dr. Mills hesitated. "Alan? What if nothing?" Dr. Kendrick snapped. "Do you really want to explain to headquarters that we're testing flight-critical materials based on something the janitor overheard while taking out the trash?" A nervous chuckle ran through the room. Frank felt it immediately. They were slipping back into arrogance, even though he knew he was right, even though they had started to consider it. They were going to dismiss him because of who he was. Frank clenched his jaw. He had done his part. He had spoken up. And if they wanted to ignore it, that was on them. He gave a slow nod. "Understood, sir." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. But what Frank didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that one of the junior engineers was still staring at the board, deep in thought. And the next day, when no one was watching, that engineer secretly ran a simulation. What he found would change everything. The next morning, a storm of curiosity and doubt swirled inside the walls of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Dr. Logan Mills sat at his desk, staring at the equations on his screen. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The janitor's idea. It had sounded ridiculous at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The problem wasn't the material of the heat shield. It was the way the stress concentrated in one location. And Frank's concept of flexible plating. It was worth testing, even if Dr. Alan Kendrick had dismissed it. Later that evening, when most of the staff had gone home, Mills called over one of the junior engineers, Carter Reynolds. "You still have access to the materials testing lab?" Mills asked. Carter frowned. "Yeah, Why? Mills exhaled. We're going to run an unofficial simulation. Carter raised an eyebrow. On what? Mills hesitated. On the janitor's idea. The experiment no one knew about. Inside the restricted materials testing lab, the screen flickered to life as Mills and Carter loaded the re-entry simulation. The original model, the one NASA had designed, failed every single time. They had run the numbers 1,000 times. The heat shield couldn't survive re-entry. This is a waste of time, Carter muttered, but Mills ignored him. Adjust the parameters, Mills ordered. Create a layered heat shield, interlocking flexible plates instead of a rigid surface. Carter sighed, but started entering the new data. This better not get us fired. A few tense minutes later, the simulation was ready. Mills hovered over the keyboard. If this didn't work, they would be right back where they started. But if it did, he pressed Enter. The simulation began. The spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere. Temperatures soared beyond 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The force of re-entry slammed against the heat shield for testing its limits. And then the numbers held. Carter leaned forward, eyes wide. The stress was evenly distributed. The flexible plates absorbed and redirected the force, preventing catastrophic failure. For the first time, the heat shield survived. Holy, Carter whispered, his voice trailing off. Mills couldn't even speak, because at that moment he realized something horrifying. The janitor was right, and that meant NASA had nearly sabotaged its own mission out of arrogance. A dangerous decision. Mills and Carter stared at the data. There was no denying it. The design worked. Mills grabbed his phone. We have to tell them. Carter's head snapped up. Tell who? Mills didn't answer. He was already dialing Dr. Alan Kendrick. The phone rang 3 times before Kendrick picked up. This better be important. Mills. Mills took a deep breath. Sir, we ran a test. A new heat shield design. Layered plating instead of a solid surface. Silence. Then Kendrick scoffed. You ran an unauthorized test? Sir, listen to me, Mills said, forcing himself to stay calm. It worked. Another beat of silence. Then Kendrick's voice turned sharp. Where did you get the design? Mills hesitated. Then he said it. Frank Holloway. A long pause. Then, are you seriously telling me you wasted hours testing a janitor's idea? Kendrick snapped. It's not just an idea, Mills said. It's a solution that could save the mission. Kendrick let out a slow, irritated breath. I told you before, we are not going to headquarters with an engineering concept that came from a janitor. Mills clenched his fist. Sir, I don't care where the idea came from. It works. But Kendrick's voice was ice cold. Drop it, Mills. Then, click. The call disconnected. Mills lowered the phone, heart pounding. They won't listen, Carter said, shaking his head. No one will. Mills inhaled sharply. Then we have to make them listen. Carter frowned. How? Mills stood up. We go straight to headquarters. A meeting that would change everything. The next day, Mills and Carter walked into NASA's headquarters. They had no appointment, no approval, but they had something more powerful. Proof. Inside the executive boardroom, NASA's top officials sat in a meeting about upcoming missions. They barely noticed as 2 nervous engineers entered the room, until Mills cleared his throat. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need 5 minutes of your time. The room fell silent. At the head of the table, NASA Director Marcus Layton looked up, frowning. Who the hell are you? Mills took a deep breath. "I'm Dr. Logan Mills, aerospace engineer. This is Carter Reynolds. We have something to show you." Layton folded his arms. "And what exactly is so important that you're interrupting a classified meeting?" Mills exhaled. Then he pulled out a flash drive. "Sir," he said, voice steady, "we solved the heat shield problem." That got their attention. One of the executives, Dr. Valerie Connors, head of spacecraft materials research, leaned forward. "That's impossible. We've exhausted every known material." "You're right," Mills said. "Reinforcing the materials won't work. But what if we changed the design?" Layton gave a skeptical look. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Mills plugged the flash drive into the large conference screen. A moment later, the simulation results appeared. The boardroom fell silent. The spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere. The heat shield absorbed and redirected force. The temperatures spiked, but the shield held. For the first time, it didn't fail. The moment of truth. The room remained silent. Finally, Director Layton stood up. He walked toward the screen, eyes narrowed as he examined the results. "This data is real?" he asked quietly. Mills nodded. "Yes, sir. We ran the test last night. It works." Layton exhaled. "Who designed this?" Mills hesitated. Then he told the truth. "A janitor," he said. "Frank Holloway." Murmurs exploded through the boardroom. One of the senior scientists scoffed. "You expect us to believe that a janitor solved a problem NASA's best engineers couldn't?" Mills stood his ground. "I expect you to believe the data." Dr. Connors frowned, still staring at the screen. "We need another test. If we're going to change the shield design this late in development, we need absolute certainty." Layton nodded. "Run it again, immediately." Mills exhaled in relief. They had a chance. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Dr. Alan Kendrick had just walked into the boardroom. And the look on his face, pure fury. A battle behind closed doors. Mills and Carter barely had time to celebrate before Kendrick pulled them into a side hallway. His face was red with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We just saved the mission," Mills said, refusing to back down. Kendrick's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "Number, you embarrassed me, and you went behind my back." Mills met his glare. "I did what had to be done." Kendrick smirked, a look that sent chills down Mills's spine. "You'll find out soon enough," Kendrick muttered. Then he walked away, leaving Mills and Carter with a sinking feeling. Because Kendrick wasn't just angry. He was plotting something, and Frank Holloway had no idea what was coming. A storm brewing behind closed doors. Frank Holloway had no idea what was happening inside NASA's headquarters. As far as he knew, his idea had been dismissed. He continued his usual shift, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, and staying out of the way. He convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, he had overstepped. But across town, a battle was unfolding. Inside a high-level NASA boardroom, the second simulation was running. The executives, engineers, and specialists watched in complete silence. The spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere. Extreme temperatures, maximum pressure, and then the heat shield held again. For the second time in 24 hours, Frank Holloway's design had survived re-entry. And now, there was no denying it. It worked. The NASA director turned toward Dr. Logan Mills. "This could save the entire mission." Mills nodded. "I know, sir." The director exhaled sharply. "Make the adjustments immediately." And just like that, Frank's idea was officially part of a billion-dollar NASA mission. But not everyone was happy, because in the corner of the room, Dr. Alan Kendrick was watching, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. This wasn't about science anymore. This was about his pride. And Alan Kendrick was not a man who let things go. The price of being right. That night, as Frank finished his shift, he noticed something strange. His ID badge wasn't working. He tried again. The light flashed red. Confused, he walked to the security desk. "Hey, something's wrong with my badge." The guard checked the system. His expression changed. "Mr. Holloway," he said hesitantly, "I was told to inform you. Your employment has been terminated." Frank's heart stopped. "What?" The guard sighed. "I'm sorry. I don't know the details, but your access has been revoked." Frank stood there, speechless. They fired him? After 30 years? After everything? The confrontation. The next morning, Dr. Mills and Carter Reynolds stormed into Alan Kendrick's office. "You fired him?" Mills snapped. Kendrick didn't even look up from his desk. "He's a janitor," Kendrick said flatly. "We don't need him anymore." Mills slammed a thick report onto Kendrick's desk. "Frank Holloway's design is the reason we still have a mission," Mills said. "And you fired him." Kendrick finally looked up. "There was a security review," he said, his tone completely indifferent. "Turns out Mr. Holloway had unauthorized access to classified conversations. That's a breach of protocol." Mills laughed bitterly. "You mean he overheard a problem and solved it?" Kendrick leaned back, smirking. "Call it what you want. The decision is final." Mills clenched his fists. Carter stepped forward. "You're really going to let your ego ruin this?" Kendrick's smirk vanished. "My decision is final," he repeated. Mills shook his head. Then he turned and stormed out. Because if NASA wouldn't fight for Frank Holloway, then he would. The media explosion. That afternoon, a headline appeared on every major news site. NASA Janitor secretly solves critical space mission problem and gets fired for it. Within hours, the story went viral. News anchors, bloggers, and online commentators tore into NASA. How does a janitor outthink NASA scientists and end up unemployed? NASA just fired the man who saved their mission. The backlash was instant. Phone calls flooded NASA's headquarters. Public relations scrambled. The press demanded answers. Then, the White House got involved. A direct message came from the president's office. Reinstate Frank Holloway immediately. NASA had no choice. Frank was coming back. The redemption. The next morning, Frank stood outside NASA headquarters. A small crowd of reporters surrounded him, shoving microphones forward. "Frank, did you know your idea would work? How do you feel about being reinstated?" Frank lifted a hand. "I just want to get back to work." Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked straight past the reporters and into the building. The moment everything changed, Frank stepped into the NASA executive boardroom. Every top official was there. The director stood. "Mr. Holloway, we owe you an apology." Frank just nodded. "I'm not looking for apologies, sir. Just respect." A murmur rippled through the room. The director cleared his throat. "Well, I'm pleased to inform you that your design has been fully implemented into the mission. In fact," he gestured to a live feed on the screen. A countdown appeared. T-10, 9, 8. Frank's heart pounded. This was it. He watched as the spacecraft, now equipped with the heat shield he designed, lifted off. Upper, upper, upper. And then it was gone, headed for space, and this time it had a chance to come home. The legend of Frank Holloway. Years later, Frank Holloway's name would be etched into history. NASA would officially credit him for saving the mission. His concept would redefine heat shield engineering for the next generation of spacecraft. And when the spacecraft returned safely to Earth, the world knew the man who saved it was never just a janitor.